Troy Baker is the latest person with a vested interest in the so-called AAA game industry to attempt to undermine Jason Schrier, a journalist who reports on abuse within the video game industry. Troy Baker, in case you didn't know, is an incredibly prolific voice actor, sometimes so much so you could be forgiven for thinking he's the video game industry's only voice actor. And Troy Baker is very proud of his work, which is a good thing, but sometimes pride can manifest as an oversensitivity to criticism. I can speak from personal experience there. Sometimes I've not handled it all that well. What makes Troy Baker's case interesting though is that the voice actor famous for playing Booker in Bioshock Infinite or Joel from The Last of Us Part 2, a game related to this, seems to take criticism of video games he's involved with personally, even if the criticism isn't about him. So here's the situation. Jason Schrier tweeted, "Video games are too long." An overly sweeping declarative statement that was deliberately so. Now this is something I do on Twitter all the time. It's fun to say that I've never heard of video games, or that all video games are shit. And recently the topic has been about game length. Now I agree, and obviously not all video games are too long, but some definitely are. For example, I think The Last of Us Part 2 is too long, and many people took Schreier's tweet to be about The Last of Us Part 2, a game he confirmed inspired the tweet because of recent discourse. Well. Naughty Dog's Neil Druckmann is already mad at Jason Schrier because Jason Schrier made jokes about that reviewer who compared The Last of Us 2 to Schindler's List, which people are still saying never happened, but it did. I mean, I can read the quote again, the quote that compares The Last of Us Part 2 to Schindler's List. The quote that people say doesn't compare The Last of Us Part 2 to Schindler's List, even though it literally does exactly that, because that's what it does. It says, "In a medium where everything is John Wick." Everything, by the way, in the medium, The Last of Us Part 2 is Schindler's List. In a medium where everything is John Wick, The Last of Us Part 2 is Schindler's List. Now, others have defended this by saying, well, he's not comparing the game to Schindler's List, he just said that the game is Schindler's List. As Neil Druckmann says, Neil Druckmann, the director of The Last of Us Part 2, he says, "To me it's clear that Jeff is comparing an emotional response between two pieces of media, not subject matter or importance. I didn't take it as a direct comparison between our game and the Holocaust itself, or even as a way to diminish the weight of that film." Well, that's what it did. It absolutely trivialized Schindler's List by comparing it to a game that is so much closer to John fucking Wick, as my good friend Jonathan Holmes pointed out. I try and explain further how a quote comparing The Last of Us Part 2 to Schindler's List is a comparison between The Last of Us Part 2 and Schindler's List, but I just end up reading the quote again. It's something we in the business like to call self-evident. Now, if you followed any of the discourse around The Last of Us Part 2, you will know that Neil Druckmann was quite offended that people found the comparison between The Last of Us Part 2 and Schindler's List funny and trivializing. And he jumped at the opportunity to dunk on Jason Schrier, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a journalist who reports on terrible abusive practices in the game industry, up to and including Naughty Dog's own tendency to overwork its stuff with crunch. Anyway, then Sony's Cory Balrog joined in to call Jason a bully and say that his bread and butter was tearing developers down, and that not everything is about his books or his articles. It's just all very inappropriate, and it looks like an industry circling the wagons to protect itself from a journalist holding it to account. And the game industry has fucking prior when it comes to that. I of course have run across many people in the game industry who don't like their authority challenged. And the industry's reputation as being overly sensitive to criticism and accountability was not helped by Troy Baker taking a big hot wet shit all over the video game industry's critics. So, as I said, Jason Schrier made a tweet, video games are too long. It got spread around Twitter quite a bit. I think most people understood that while it was making a point, it was doing so in a sledgehammery over-the-top way. Troy Baker, however, responded in a manner that could only be accurately described as embarrassing. Responding to Jason with a smarmy, "I'll just leave this here," referring to a quote that he provided from Theodore Roosevelt that says, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles," you're so strong, Troy, "or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood." Marred with sweat and blood! The Last of Us Part 2 truly is the Schindler's fucking list of video games. Who strives valiantly, Troy, who errs, who comes short again and again, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Now, I'm not making fun of the quote itself. That had an original context, and it wasn't about a voice actor. It wasn't about video game development. It wasn't about games being too long. And if we want to talk about the blood, sweat and tears put into The Last of Us Part 2, well, I've talked about that a lot, because Naughty Dog overworks its fucking staff. It wasn't until I just read the quote out that it hit me how patently absurd it is to use it in this context. And when you remember that this quote was deployed because Jason Schrier simply said video games are too long, it's difficult not to drown in the sheer pomposity of it all. What makes it particularly strange is the fact that Jason Schrier said nothing about Troy Baker. He simply said video games are too long, which was itself a reference to a game that Troy simply happened to be in. So Troy Baker's response to that was to shit on the very notion of criticism. That's what that quote is being used for. It's all about how critics are timid and useless and don't know victory and defeat. And I gotta wonder why Troy Baker didn't deploy this quote while The Last of Us Part 2 was getting 9s and 10s out of 10. Sometimes it's almost as if the game industry is full of people who love you and have all the time in the world for you, while you're fawning over them and praising them. And the moment you stop doing that and start asking for some accountability, they drop you like a bucket of cold cum. Not that I speak from any experience of being treated that way by the game industry. Oh yeah. Yes, I do. Yeah. And funnily enough, I actually have experience of getting into it with Troy Baker over video game criticism. Video game criticism that, like in this case, in no way was aimed at Troy Baker's performances. He's a good fucking voice actor, but he seems to take it as a personal slight when something he's involved with gets criticized. Now, I thought Batman Arkham Origins was fucking rubbish. You can disagree, you're welcome to, but that's not really the point here. I thought Arkham Origins was rubbish, and I said so. I gave it a review with a mediocre score because I thought it was a mediocre game, and then before you know it, me and Troy are sort of hashing this out with him implying that I was being unprofessional, that I wasn't doing my job as a critic correctly, and I thought at the time, like, mate, I know you play the Joker in this game, and that's a plum role and a big deal for you, but I thought the game was shit. I thought your performance was very good, but I didn't like the game, and I'm sorry if you take that to heart. It was not an indictment of you. None of this is an indictment of Troy Baker. Well, not his performance. His behaviour outside of it, yes. The fella's got a bit of a reputation of being somewhat full of himself. And there's nothing wrong with a healthy bit of ego, but when you are responding to an innocuous tweet with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt that is being used to make video games look like the most noble profession on earth, you might want to scale it back a bit. It's just strange to me how in this industry, and in the wrestling industry as well actually, you get people who are perfectly fine with critics and reviews while those reviews do very little, if anything, to challenge them. But it only takes one bit of criticism for them to decide that all reviews are bullshit and critics don't know what they're talking about. Now, I wasn't going to do a full video on this. I've made jokes about how Troy Baker's only upset because he must be paid by the word, and I was going to leave it at that. But I really liked Patricia Hernandez's article on Polygon that was titled The Last of Us Part 2 has become a minefield, which fucking, yeah, it has. It's a real good article, there's a lot of good points made, but pertinent to this is the paragraph that says, that protective shield around The Last of Us Part 2 can be seen anytime the creatives or talent behind the game jump into critical conversations about it. It's made talking about the game exhausting. On the one hand, we have bigots trying their hardest to tear the game down for its inclusion of queer characters. On the other hand, we've got the people who actually made the game putting their figurative fists up. On the third hand, go with it, we've got fans and professional critics trying to share their own takes on the game, good and bad and everything in between. She mentioned that if we are going to take The Last of Us Part 2 seriously, then yeah, criticism is necessary. People will have critical conversations. Talking about art isn't all that interesting if nobody's allowed to say that they don't think it's fucking perfect. But this is the bit that really caught my eye, and it ties into not just the discourse around The Last of Us Part 2, but everything that the show that this channel has been talking about for a while now. Hernandez writes, based on my own conversations with fellow critics, many have assumed an air of wariness about The Last of Us Part 2 discourse. It feels as if there are all these big larger forces working toward maintaining the status quo when it comes to big budget games. It's not enough that the game is selling well and that most reviews are positive. You can't fall out of line with that general consensus even as a joke without having to worry about whether or not a publisher will be looking over your shoulder or if hundreds of fans will blow up your social media. It is not an environment that is conducive to encouraging honest reviews or critical discussion, which is ultimately a disservice to the game itself. Boom. Thank you. It's exactly what the AAA game industry fucking wants. It's not been lost on me and many others that the video game industry is always very, very quiet when game critics or hell, just women in the industry are being harassed en masse. When someone's critical of a game and they, I don't know, they get lots of personal attacks and threats and have their website DDoS'd, never has a publisher stepped in to try and cool things down or take some of the heat away, to stick up for the reviewer, or at the very least tell their fans not to be trash. Now, I'm not going to say that it's a deliberate effort on the part of the game industry to foster the resentment that sometimes crops up between the community and reviewers, but I am saying that game publishers, we fucking see you. We see your inaction. And your silence speaks volumes. So when I see Neil Druckmann quote-tweeting Jason Schrier and saying nothing about the resulting dog pile, when I see Troy Baker quote-tweeting Jason Schrier and saying nothing about the associated dog pile, when I see Cory Balrog pretty much confirm that he doesn't like Jason Schreier's articles, again those aforementioned ones about crunch and abuse in the game industry, I must confess to finding the whole thing a little bit disturbing. Publishers do everything they can to control the narrative around their games. They carefully select who gets review copies based on who's most likely to praise them. In my experience, they do not pay reviewers off. That's always been a ridiculous accusation. But publishers and PR do nonetheless hedge their bets. They're happy to work with anyone who has a history of being agreeable, as confirmed to me by a PR rep and discussed in an old Jimquisition about wild cards in games criticism. At some point I'll have to do a full-on Jimquisition talking about just how poisoned the game review world is, largely as a result of obscene publisher pressure, but for now, just remember that takeaway. The discussions around The Last of Us Part 2 have gotten exhausting, and they've gotten to a point where people are risking dealing with a massive pile-on of abuse for saying the wrong thing about the game. And not only do game publishers ignore that, we now have people who work on these games stoking this shit. That's not fucking good. No, publishers aren't paying outlets for high scores, but they threaten, mostly implicitly but sometimes explicitly. They silently condone bullying, and they do everything they can to obfuscate investigative journalism and deny those who do anything but tell you that everything is awesome. It's not awesome. The game industry is rotten from fucking within and has fermented an atmosphere where abuse of all kinds is common and people are afraid to talk about it. This culture of silence and conformity in the so-called AAA game industry needs to fucking stop. And that's why seeing Troy Baker shitting on the very notion of game criticism makes me very concerned.